Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, I want to start by acknowledging that the symposium and this panel is taking place on Huichin, which is the ancestral territory of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. So with that being said, I want to thank everyone for coming out today and the organizers of the symposium for inviting me to moderate this panel. So my name is Leandrew Dailey. I am a third-year PhD candidate from UC San Francisco, and originally from the Navajo Nation, and I'm going to be our moderator for today's panel on Native American DNA. So the format for today's panel will begin with a 40-minute discussion between me and our two panelists, followed by a 20-minute Q&A session with you, our audience. Our volunteer will bring the mic to anyone who wants to ask a question, and we're going to do our best to alternate the questions between the live audience and the virtual audience. So on March 21st, 2022, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published a study that was able to identify a genetic link between Muwekma Ohlone descendants from here in the Bay Area to ancient individuals at various ancestral heritage sites throughout the Bay Area. This study was done through heavy tribal oversight, and the questions that were posed were developed together by researchers and tribal members. The Muwekma Ohlone tribe was considered extinct in the 1920s by the famous anthropologist Alfred Kroeber, and because of this, the current descendants are not a federally recognized tribe. However, they have been petitioning for the last 30 years to seek federal recognition by the United States government. So a little bit more context, a federally recognized tribe possesses both the authority and the right to regulate activities on their lands independently from state governments. And this is what is referred to as tribal sovereignty. So this genetic linkage offers legitimate sovereignty for descendants of the Muwekma Ohlone, in which they can use this to strengthen their petition for federal recognition. In conjunction, I really want to emphasize that the data and information that was collected from this study has a profound potential influence on the lives of the Muwekma Ohlone people, descendants. Despite this being a very beneficial study for the tribe, this vetted interest in Native American DNA is comprised of a very complex history between Native communities and non-Native researchers. So today we will begin exploring this complex history to understand how we can begin to democratize scientific knowledge production. And I'm incredibly honored to have this conversation with two special panelists. So Dr. Katrina Klaw is an associate professor at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus in the Division of Biomedical Informatics and Personalized Medicine, and faculty in the Colorado Center for Personalized Medicine. Broadly, her research program focuses on personalizing medicine pharmacogenomics and the ethical, legal, social, and cultural implications of genomic research with American Indian, Alaska Native, and other indigenous communities. Dr. Klaw's current research focuses on pharmacogenetic variation, tobacco cessation, and nicotine metabolism, evolutionary medicine, and examining the perspectives of genomic research in tribal communities. Dr. Klaw grew up on the Navajo Nation, and she obtained her Bachelor's of Science in Biology and her Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology at Arizona State University. She obtained her PhD in Genome Sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle in 2013. And Joseph Urasheta is an Amerindian indigenous scientist, Puderepecha from Mexico, at the Native Biodata Consortium in the Cheyenne River Lakota Nation. Mr. Urasheta has been a scientist since 1990, where he started as a bench biotechnician and worked across many disciplines. In 2014, he graduated from the University of Washington, Seattle, with a Master of Pharmaceutics and Bioethics under Doctors Ken Thummel and Wiley Burke. And he is currently finishing a Doctor's of Public Health in Environmental Health and Engineering from Johns Hopkins University under Doctors Anna Navasasian and Paul Lark. Mr. Urasheta is passionately working to end Amerindian indigenous health disparity by the wearing of many research hats of law, ethics, policy, genomics, omics, health outcomes, epidemiology, healthcare prevention, intervention, and allostatic load from systemic racism. Mr. Urasheta believes that all data and resources must be seen as unforeseen futures, where their value will constantly change. He feels this data must be secured for indigenous economic sustainability. So to sort of kick off the conversation, If you Google the term Native American DNA, you get a wide variety of results, including posts from direct-to-consumer companies like Ancestry.com, population studies from journals like Science, and a wide variety of other results. So there's a lot of interpretations to this term, but I really want to kick off this conversation by first defining what is Native American DNA, and really hoping to understand when it emerged as a scientific research object, why is it of particular interest to geneticists and molecular anthropologists? And Katrina, I wanted to start with you since you got your PhD in genome sciences.
Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction, Leandrew. I'm very happy to be on the panel today. So what is Native American DNA? So I think in the literal definition, it is DNA, which everyone has, and it's from Native American peoples. But I think that when we think of Native American DNA, it can have different meanings. So in Navajo, the term for DNA is ina bet'ol. So when you translate this into English, it means much more than a vial full of DNA. So ina in Navajo means the lifeways, and bet'ol is the strands. So you could translate it as the strands of life, but it really means much more in the cultural context. A lot of times people think of this as the very essence of our life and how we are. There are very real cultural connections to people's DNA and blood. This is our ancestors, what they passed on to our generation. So I think that when we say Native American DNA, there are definitely very cultural and traditional connotations to it. And as Leandrew mentioned, in the sense of a lot of the direct-to-consumer testing, there has also been this idea that Native American DNA can reveal things like your identity or your tribal affiliation, which I would argue is not correct. So there are many different ways of thinking about Native American DNA.
Thank you, Katrina. Joe, would you like to add further comment to this?
Yeah, so one of them is a political definition and a way of protecting tribal sovereignty, and the other one is sort of a resource for future and current capitalist endeavors. We know about Italian ancestry, which is made up of African, European, and East Asian mixture, but they're just Italians, right? There's no quibbling over who that belongs to. It belongs to Italians. So a lot of tribes have avoided the racial definition in order to assert their sovereignty in that same political context. However, right now, because genomic science is still so young and still so new, most of the low-hanging fruit is in populations that are isolated in some way. They can be culturally isolated, like the Amish. They could be geographically isolated, like, say, people from Polynesia, or they can be a combination of isolations, like here in the Americas before 1492. And it's that low-hanging fruit right now that is at the most risk from being taken away from Native people of the Americas and being marketed as some sort of, at first, entertainment, hobbyist kind of thing, but very soon, if not already, become a very large political football to cause not only racial and ethnic division, but also division of monetary resources.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is that there's sort of like a context that exceeds beyond genome sciences that sort of plays a role in this interest. Can you expand a little bit more on that? The social and cultural implications of this interest in genomic native DNA? Katrina?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. So the social and cultural aspects of Native DNA. So I think that um, when we think about Native identity and DNA, we are probably the only peoples or ethnic groups in the United States who have to prove who they are. And this is often through enrollment blood quantum cards. So every person enrolled in a tribal nation has either a little card or certificate saying that we are X percentage Native American. We are probably the only peoples in the United States who have to do this. And it's not just for identity purposes, it's actually also for access to healthcare purposes, access to different things that we have to prove our identity. So I think that when we think about that aspects, it's very different for a lot of Native Americans because it's both a political, it's a cultural identity. There may be some biology playing a role in this, but I think that each tribe, because of its sovereignty, gets to decide who is a tribal member. So there's no blanket for tribal identity. It's really the tribes who have that role of determining who is their member. And this can be based on blood quantum, or it can be based on familial descent. It can be based on a variety of factors. And some tribes do have members who were adopted into the tribe as well. So this is really based on the tribes who are enacting their tribal sovereignty by doing this. But I think that when we start to think about Native DNA in the context of direct-to-consumer testing and other, and even often in a lot of biomedical studies, we have this general term, American Indian, Alaska Native. So what does that mean when somebody enrolls in your study and checks that box? It can mean a variety of things. It can be, often it's self-identification. And there are over 574 federally recognized tribes across the United States. This is excluding state-recognized and those unrecognized tribes in the US as well. So this is a vast, diverse group of people who have different languages and cultures, and I think it's checking a box that says you're American Indian, Alaska Native is probably not sufficient if biomedical sciences is to really benefit tribal populations. So I kind of went on a tangent there, but yeah, let me know if you want me to.
Joe, is there anything else that you kind of want to add to that question regarding the social and political components to this?
Yeah, so indigeneity throughout the Americas is conferred differently depending on the nation state. So it's very different in Canada compared to the United States. And Canada in 2012 had their sovereignty reduced quite a bit by the Harper administration. So really, in the world, American Indians and Alaska Natives are the only ones with any sort of concretized recognition of their sovereignty with some legal teeth. The rest of the Americas, indigenous people are still living in the 1800s. They're still not recognized. They still don't have control of their resources or their government. Other than Bolivia, there isn't a country in Latin America that has control of any of their resources, and certainly not their genetic resources. And I'm talking broadly. I'm talking about plants, because a lot of the commercial resources in the world today are either agriculture or pharmaceutics, and most of them come out of Latin America. And so they're not in control of those, and they're certainly not in control of their biological DNA, their human DNA. And the relabeling of a lot of indigenous people in Latin America as Latino or Hispanic is a planned erasure. And why that's important is because most of these companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com that are making millions of dollars a year on selling ancestry tests for people to see if they have any native ancestry, that's not coming from American Indian DNA, that's coming from DNA from Central and South America, and a lot of people don't know that. So not only are the people who are supplying that resource not getting any money, but then it's undermining sovereignty for people here in the United States. It's just a very deeply layered problem, and it is a problem.
Yeah, it is a very important problem, and I'm really hoping that we can sort of begin to unpack that problem in the context of understanding how research with Native communities has sort of led to this problem. So Joe, I'm hoping you could help us kind of understand how the interest in the history of genetic research amongst Native American and Indigenous populations has really cultivated this mistrust in scientific entities by tribal groups.
I think the mistrust is general and historic, and it doesn't necessarily have to pertain to research or the sciences. I mean, there's lots of reasons for mistrust between Native people and all the immigrants that have come to the Americas, but science particularly has a number of egregious research harms for Native Americans. You've heard, of course, what happened to African Americans like Henrietta Lacks or the Tuskegee sharecroppers, but you don't often hear of all the different instances of research harm for American Indians. One of them happened in Alaska around the World War II era, where Alaskan natives were given iodine-125 just to see how a human would do with low levels of radioactivity. Another one is tuberculosis through many tribes in the Americas was allowed to run rampant on purpose just to see what the end result would be of a long, like, not a life course, but end of life course of tuberculosis. And they just go on. And so I think the research mistrust stems from a lot of that, in addition to the United States government not fulfilling its treaty obligation for proper Indian health care.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and treaties are an important component to this. Katrina, do you have any examples of cases where there's been this mistrust that has been cultivated?
Yeah, I think that in particular, I agree with Joe, where a lot of this mistrust is not directly related to research, though research has exasperated it. There is a pretty well-known case with the Havasupai tribe. The Havasupai tribe is a tribe that lives at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and they've lived there for a long time, and back in the early 2000s, 1990s to 2000s, a researcher who happened to be an anthropologist was working with the tribe, and the tribe was interested in doing research related to, or studies related to diabetes, since their community had high levels of diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And they entered this agreement with researchers from Arizona State University. And then a couple of years later, in the early 2000s, tribal members attended a dissertation defense, which had nothing to do with type 2 diabetes research, but was involving those samples collected from the tribal members. So this resulted in a lawsuit of the tribe against the Arizona Board of Regents back in 2005 or 2004. And this was eventually settled in 2010. So because it was settled, unfortunately, there really was no resolution. The tribe was provided funds for health care, and the samples from the individuals who donated, participated in the studies, were returned to the tribe, but unfortunately there was no settling, or there was no verdict in the lawsuit. And it was around this time as well that our tribe, the Navajo tribe, back in 2002, actually instituted a moratorium on genetic research. And it was not only, the Havasupai case happened after the Navajo Nation had already instituted a moratorium, but it was around this time when a lot of things were happening in the world in which Native Americans were very hesitant to participate in any genetic study. The Human Genome Diversity Project was happening at this time as well, and a lot of indigenous peoples all over the world did not want to participate in this project just because of various ways that the project implied that they needed to collect samples from indigenous peoples and isolated populations before they became extinct. And so this did not resonate well with many indigenous communities. So these are some examples of what was happening in the early 2000s when the human genome was being sequenced, and why tribes were really rethinking their participation. So fast forward 20 years, and actually the Navajo Nation has had this moratorium in place since 2002, and today, this year, it was instituted in April of 2002, so exactly this month, we're 20 years later, that moratorium is still in place. There is still a lot of distrust of outside researchers coming in, and especially related to genetics and DNA. So there's still all of these things that haven't really changed in over 20 years. So how do we start working with communities, and how do we do this right? Well, I think a lot of things have changed from 20 years ago. There are now trained people, PhDs, who are Navajo and geneticists. I'm one of them, but I'm not the only one. There are far more Navajo and Native American biomedical researchers, and I think that a lot of these issues that we're talking about today are being brought to light because there are more indigenous researchers in the field, and I think that is a huge change from when a lot of this work was done in the past, and is a huge opportunity for moving forward.
Yeah, and as we're beginning to shift this field, there's a lot of benefits that can be obtained from genetic research. For instance, your lab does pharmacogenomics with Native communities. So I kind of want to shift gears in this conversation.
Can I just add
Oh,
something?
yeah, sorry.
So in addition to the Havasupai, at the same time, the Neutral North experienced a similar situation with a researcher who had taken samples to the University of Utah and then to Cambridge and then died. And then it became a fight about who owned it. Was it Cambridge or Utah? Cambridge quickly released their claim, but Utah was trying to fight with the Neutral North in British Columbia. They gave up too, and the tribe got those samples back. And then the same thing happened in Brazil with the Yanomama tribe, and they got their samples back. But the thing that I'm most concerned with tribes when they have a lack of understanding about how this process goes is they got the original blood tubes back. So they're not separated out into their different components of plasma, serum, different cell types, and DNA. So my question is always like, how much did they get back? Did they just get the blood tubes back and nothing else? Is that data still wandering around in the ether somewhere? Is it on somebody's computer or hard drive? And then where are the DNA and RNA isolates? Where is that stuff at? And this is the thing that concerns me most, is because people try, or at least make the appearance of doing something ethical, but is it really ethical if they don't tell the tribe everything? And that's what's going on right now, is that federal programs that fund this kind of research don't tell tribes everything. They don't tell them all of their rights, all of the possible disadvantages. They don't tell them everything. And Dr. Claw's right, is things have gotten better, but one of the things that I just heard recently in South Dakota is the same old thing about Native Americans being alcoholics. Now, this is a very hard to kill trope. The University of Arizona tried to kill this trope in, I think it was 2016. They put out a series of papers that showed that Native Americans weren't more alcoholic than any other ethnicity, and it mostly had to do with social determinants of health and socioeconomics. But just about a month ago, a researcher in South Dakota was doing research on DNA to prove that Native Americans were alcoholics genetically. So these things are very, very long-lived and hard to kill in the public's imagination, including educated people like scientists.
And I'd really like to sort of change the conversation towards like what you were saying about this federal oversight and these research regulations. This probably points to the concept that the process of doing research with Native communities can be very complicated. So I'm hoping if you could really kind of help us understand what is the formal process of doing, if a research group is interested in doing a research study with Native communities. And Katrina, could you start us off with that question?
Yeah, sure. I think that it varies, and I don't know if it's really more complicated than any other research design or study that someone is doing. Just as in any study that involves human subjects, you have to go through your institutional IRB. The other step that is more unique in the cases of working with tribes, if there is a tribal oversight body, which sometimes there is a tribal IRB, or sometimes you have to go through the tribal council. So that is an additional step, but I don't think it's unlike the institutional review board, and it does vary drastically. I've gone with my tribal partners, I've gone through many different IRB oversight boards, and sometimes it's a very simple process, other times it's a lot of work and back and forth, attending of community meetings, ideally. So it does vary quite a bit. And then something that might be considered human subjects research, non-human subjects research at a university might not be the same thing at the tribal level. They still want to know what's going on in terms of research. So I think those are some of the processes that I've gone through with the tribes that I work with. And also there is a certain level of oversight in terms of different presentations that you give, as well as any publications that are published. You do often have to send those into the tribal oversight body before any of those are published. And it's not, a lot of people argue that this is biasing your science, but I think that it, in fact, is probably enhancing it more, because the tribal members can review the publication and make sure that you are representing them appropriately and making sure that you're being respectful. I think it's just being a respectful person when you go through these oversight boards. So those are some of the processes that I've gone through. I don't think that it is necessarily that much harder. I do think it is a more long-term investment, but with any study that any geneticist is doing, you are still making a long-term investment in these projects, and I think it's just a little bit more work, but not by a lot.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a quote by Dr. Kim Tallbear, where she says that if you're going to work with indigenous communities on genetics, you have to be willing to make lifelong relations. And I was hoping that you could sort of explain or help us understand what that means, Joe.
So going back to some of what Dr. Claus said and what I said earlier about tribes not having this expertise, which we hope will be filled in by folks like Katrina and myself. And Katrina and I are part of several different education projects where we're training young indigenous students to do this stuff for their communities. But because they don't have that expertise, one of the gaps is implementation. And so, this idea of helicopter science, where they collect the data, they take it, and then they never come back, it's not improved by some researchers where they come back, but they deliver the data in almost a meaningless or indecipherable way to the community where it came from. So a longer relationship with the tribe helps to further that education and assist the tribe in getting federal services. So where I've had trouble is that often communities are like, well, you didn't do anything, because they don't understand the process. And I said, well, I can't do anything. No researcher can do anything, because we don't have the proxy of the federal government. We don't have the proxy of the tribal government. Somebody at the tribe has to trigger an action with the federal government so that you can change or improve your services. One of them, since both Dr. Claw and I have worked in pharmacogenomics, one of them is changing formularies for tribal health systems. We can't do that. We're researchers. We can't do that. But if we stayed in long-term relationship with the community, we can help put them in touch with people who can, or the process that can do that. And so the process is long because it involves the government accounting agency, which oversees the Indian Health Service, and they only change their formulary every 3 to 5 years. So some of that's been streamlined in the last 10 years or so, but it's still difficult. If there was a blockbuster drug that preferentially worked for Native Americans and it cost a lot of money, it would be hard to get that implemented at an Indian Health Service clinic. So that the amount of time that you spend with a community not only helps educate and bridge some of those gaps, but also provides the researcher with the opportunity to learn the system for themselves and help them make those changes.
I also want to sort of follow up on Joe's remarks about a lot of tribal nations being understaffed, under-resourced. So when I talked about tribal IRBs, there are only about 46 tribal IRBs right now that have gone through that rigorous process of becoming a tribal IRB. So when you think of that, there are 46 in the United States. There are over 574 tribes. That's just crazy to think about. And sometimes tribal councils can take over some of this work, but when a researcher is coming into the community, we need to make sure that we're not putting the onus of all of these considerations in the research and protocols. We have to make sure we're not putting the onus on the community, because they're already under-resourced, they're already understaffed, and asking all of this from them again and again is a lot to ask from a community. So you have to really think about, what are you bringing into the community? What are the benefits of the research? Or are you helping, are there other ways that you are impacting the community, such as training some of the students and other people from the community? So those are different things you have to think about.
Yeah, and I'd really like to point out that sort of shift in this field towards really engaging communities. And despite that, their Native Americans do remain heavily underrepresented and understudied in genetic and clinical health research. So sort of talking to that point, how do we balance the need for practical research while reconciling with the history of scientific research, and not just scientific research, but the treatment of Native American people? Joe, I sort of wanted to start with you, because you take a very intersectional approach to these types of issues.
I hope I can answer your question. I think that, again, Dr. Claw and I, our network keeps growing. We both met each other in 2009, and we've been on a lot of different projects and boards together. And we just keep meeting more and more Native academics, not necessarily from genomics, but from law, policy, ethics, demography, lots of different environmental research. And our network is growing, and I think that, at least I feel optimistic that we're at a crucial point where we're going to start tipping the scales a little bit and changing things in Native communities. And where I think the change that needs to be made is an understanding about sovereignty. I think that a lot of outsiders want sovereignty to disappear, and you can make an argument that it's been arranged that way. And a lot of us, we want tribal sovereignty to grow. We want it to become bigger and stronger. And one way is bringing to the fore different types of legal arrangements between the federal government and tribes, like treaties for treaty tribes and like corporate law for the tribes in Alaska. Because a lot of this stuff is quickly becoming monetized, I think it's very important that the federal government not see tribes as sort of bioproperty where they can just extract the data and give nothing back. Whereas if you couch it in this idea of treaty obligation, you can't provide education, you can't provide healthcare, you can't provide housing, you can't provide any of these things without data. And if they're going to collect the data, then that data should be used for that treaty obligation. So they are trying to say that treaty obligations are these three things over here: housing, healthcare, education, but the data is over here and it's separate. They don't want to put them together, and we want to put them together because they do have a use, and they should have the use for Native people.
So it seems that sovereignty is not only important outside of the scope of genomic research, but sovereignty is also important in research itself. I'm hoping that you can sort of help us understand that a little bit more, Katrina, in regards to this new term that's referred to as data sovereignty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that data sovereignty and governance is going to be, or is very important in any study that is done with tribal communities. So within all of my projects, there is a very clear written understanding that the data that is generated is the tribe's data, and the samples that are donated as a part of the research study belong to the tribe. This is very clear in a lot of the informed consent forms, in all of the understandings between the researcher and the tribal partner. And I don't think of them really as participants. I like the term partners because they are really a part of the research process as a partner, and are involved ideally in all aspects of the research process, from the not just to recruit participants, but involved in designing the whole study. So in one tribe, we actually did a qualitative study before we did propose any research projects to see what was really of interest in the tribal nation. And sometimes the interests were outside of my research specialty, so I'm happy to refer things, but if there is an overlap between some of the priority areas for the tribe and what I do, then that's when the research moves forward. I think that we all need to recognize that it's okay to back away. It's okay if a tribe says no and you're like, okay, all right, that's fine. There are plenty of other ideas and projects that you can move forward with. You don't need to always do the project that you propose to do with, if a tribe does not want that to happen. So I think it's really understanding these basic principles when in any interaction, and also making it clear to your colleagues. I'm obviously in the School of Medicine in a personalized medicine center who actively is trying to increase diversity in some of the cohorts, but you just have to make it clear from the beginning that I am not going to give you access to these people's samples. If you want to be a part of that partnership, then there are ways to do that, and I'm happy to help you, but I am not going to just open these doors to the tribal communities.
Yeah, thank you for that response. You know, really building on this idea of sovereignty outside of, within like the scope of research. How is it that you think that we can really begin to shift the paradigm of research So that way there's more self-determination for Native and Indigenous communities within the scope of research. And Joe, I wanted to start with you because you do a lot of work with Native Biodata Consortium, which is the first Native biobank.
Well, I think that, and I just tweeted this the other day. Yes, I'm 55 and I still tweet. I had an interaction with a NIH group the other day, and they're still doing things sort of like from the 1970s, this whole "we are giving you a gift" kind of thing, when actually I feel that Native people, if they were to participate in research, are giving the world a gift. And so people were a little bit taken aback by my stance of, similar to Dr. Claw, where I wasn't just going to open the door and let them have what they wanted just because I'm the gatekeeper, or they saw me as the gatekeeper. And so I tweeted that instead of this top-down approach of capacity building, that it really should come from the ground up. It should come from the community, and they should say, I want an Indigenous researcher to look like this, and I want an Indigenous researcher to follow these rules. And I think that the ethics doing the research should be Indigenous ethics, not ethics that comes from the NIH. And the person that I was having words with was in awe that I didn't want to participate in a sort of training possibility that was going to remove me further from the community. And I said, well, I'm really interested in helping the tribe do this for themselves the way they want to do it.
Thank you. Speaking of that sort of bottom-up approach, Katrina, do you feel that like your role as a Native scientist, a Navajo scientist at CU, really sort of emphasizes that idea and more pushes the scale towards self-determination?
I like to think so. I'm probably one of a very small handful of Native Americans who have a genetics research lab, or even who has a PhD. I was looking at these numbers a couple days ago, and in 2018, there were 10 Native PhD graduates in that year from the biomedical sciences across the United States, 10 people. And that number really hasn't changed in the years preceding 2018. So just thinking about that, that's such a small number. And a lot of the people who are competing for these NIH-level grants, NSF-level grants, you often have to have a PhD in order to apply to some of these things, but not necessarily even just having a PhD. You need to sort of have some institutional support. You have to be able to write well. You have to have those collaborations in place and networks in place to really show that you are capable of leading these larger projects. So I think that out of those 10 PhD graduates in 2018, I don't know if any of them is leading any large NIH level grants. So I think that really trying to think about the future and where Native peoples are leading a lot of these large projects is really important to consider. And I think that a lot of organizations are really moving this forward. The ACEs, American Indian Society for Engineering and Science, they have a Lighting the Pathway program in which I was a part of that. They provide mentoring between the trainee and a faculty. So that was really played a big role in me getting to the level where I am. But there are other programs like the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, SING, where Joe and I are faculty, in which we really try to provide mentorship, but also expose people to genomic research and some of the ethical issues. I remember I was a SING participant back in 2011, and I remember I was a graduate student, third-year graduate student. I thought I knew a lot about genomics, and I went into the Sing workshop, and I and another, a social scientist, were sitting next to each other. She was Indigenous, actually Kim Talbert. And we both saw the same talk. It was about corn genomics, and I remember just being really, wow, that's so cool to know all these things about corn genomics. And I just remember her reaction. She was beside me. She was like, wow, I could barely stop myself from walking out of this talk. She was so angry. And so it was because of some of the language that the scientist was using as they were describing that Native peoples discovered or just happened to find corn with these properties, but there was no acknowledging that Native peoples had grown and developed these corn strains. It was just like, oh, they happened to find these. And I think that really opened my eyes to why we need ethical training, we need cultural competency as scientists, and if we only go down this one path, I think you're missing out a lot. And that's the same when I think about Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, trying to think about how do you incorporate that. So a lot of the work that I'm doing with my own tribal community, we are trying to really think about these issues from the Navajo lens as opposed to the Western perspective. So I think I digressed.
No, and that's a perfect segue into this final question. And just like for full context, Dr. Kim Dalbear, who Katrina just mentioned, has a book called Native American DNA, which this panel was loosely inspired by, but sort of really talking about these community engaged research models. What kind of research can we begin to address regarding Native and Indigenous communities? And Joe, I want to start with you with this.
So I think that all of this is really coming to a very critical and dangerous point, because this last year, Canada, the United States, Australia, and the EU put out more than $200 million towards machine learning and artificial intelligence. And in my view, not only is that dangerous because of the amount of data that they're going to collect and put through a computer that's inaccurate data, because a lot of the data that's been collected, Indigenous or populations of color, is inaccurate. I mean, it's got all kinds of demographic, social, cultural, there's lots and lots of inaccuracies. And now that's going to be fed through a computer, and then it's going to be instantiated as the truth. So that's a worry. The other thing is that it gets around this ethical question of consent. If it's already digitized somewhere, or it can be digitized somewhere, and then fed into a computer, the tribes and all the individual participants don't have any say-so over how that data is used. Because what the research that me and Dr. Claude do is basic research, which is only informed by a policy called the Common Rule. Other data sets like public health, the FDA, clinical data in HIPAA, lots of incarceration data, lots of military data, that all that Native people have a stake in that data too, was never consented for. So that data is all digitized, can be fed into a computer. So this is where I think that we really need to start talking in earnest with tribes. It's like, this thing is about to happen that's massive, and you have no consent over it. You have no say-so over what they say about you or your people. And I think that we're still focusing on the Common Rule when most of technology is moving way past us, way too fast.
Do you, Katrina, do you feel like this kind of lack of knowledge between Indigenous communities and in this rapid technology that's evolving, do you think that sort of plays do you think that affects your ability to ask community-embedded questions for the Navajo Nation?
I think so. I think that the common rule is what guides a lot of research projects, but I think we should really think of the common rule as sort of just the bare minimum you could do. I think a lot of other fields outside of biomedical research have really embraced different types of community-engaged research that really move beyond the common rule and include a lot of ethical, social, and cultural understandings and buy-in from the community. So I think that once we start advocating for this, and I think that Joe and other people from the SING consortium have been advocating for this, and I think that things are slowly changing, but we could always, I think, yeah, and the whole data thing is just something that is really unaddressed. Like, what do we even do? We're generating all of this data, and how are tribes supposed to keep sovereignty over it when you can have it on multiple computers on the cloud, and you can also have them stored on servers, but what do we do with this in the future, and how do we think about this? So yeah, I think those are really important emerging questions that we'll have to tackle in the field.
Yeah, and that brings us to the end of these prearranged questions, but I really hope that this discussion was informative for all of you as much as it was for me. Now we're going to transition into the audience Q&A session. So if you have any questions, there's a microphone up there, and feel free to walk up and ask your question, and we'll do our best to answer.
Hi, thank you for a great discussion. I wanted to ask if you could maybe expand on what you would like to see major science societies in this field, what they could be doing to sort of promote cultural change. So thinking like ASHG, American Society of Human Genetics, Genetic Society of America, AAAS, where I work. What would you like to see them doing more proactively to support more ethical frameworks moving forward?
I think that, and this just happened yesterday. I was surprised. I was on an NHGRI call, and there were Native and non-Native people alike describing all the points of leverage that can change to remove systemic racism from federal funding agencies, and there was a lot of resistance. And everybody was sort of making the same point, that even though some of these companies like 23andMe are moving way faster than the NIH can ever hope to move, the NIH can be like the turtle in the hare story, where if slow and steady is going to win the race. If the NIH and these different scientific organizations do the right thing and collect data in the right way and then analyze it in a transdisciplinary fashion, they will produce scientifically better data than 23andMe can ever hope to produce. And I think that's what organizations like you described need to do, is come up with very strong talking points about how the science is going to be improved by doing this the right way.
And I also think that I think the NIH is definitely funding a lot of these studies and should have some type of ethical guidance that they require investigators who are funded by them to follow. I think that at minimum, that are including some of these cultural values from different communities, but also the people who are publishing the work, different journals should require these ethical principles, and also every investigator should be responsible for learning these ethical principles and following them, and making sure that your trainees are also aware of these principles. So I think that we can't really rely on the indigenous researchers, the indigenous scientists, trainees to really be the ones who are saying, oh, let's uphold these higher ethical standards. It really should be us and scientists who are making sure to inform themselves and uphold these standards themselves. I think that by relying on Indigenous trainees to bring this up, they are already under enough pressure. And I think societies as well can uphold different ethical principles. The ASHG has often put out these ethical guidelines. I participated in one a couple years ago where it was ethical guidelines related to ancient DNA. So they put these guidelines out, but are trying to create some voice in the sphere of ethics for people to follow. So I think that thinking about this more clearly and putting out these guidelines would be helpful for researchers.
That reminds me, the ancient DNA is one of those areas that doesn't require consent or tribal consultation, and that's dangerous because as technology gets better to analyze samples that are 10,000, 5,000, or 1,000 years old, they don't really need to go and approach tribes for that information because right now there's no rules around it, and they can get the same sort of data that they're looking for from living people from going through museum shelves, and I think that's a big danger.
Thank you each for your time. I really appreciate this conversation. So I wanted to create some space to talk about non-human native DNA. I think you each mentioned examples, whether it's the maize genome or bioproducts understood from indigenous wisdom. And I wondered what your thoughts on or how this DNA from Native American or indigenous wisdom should be managed, and if it differs from the way that human DNA might be managed. And also with the specific consideration that a lot of this wisdom has already been commercialized or distributed in ways that human DNA may not have been.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that right now analyzing microbiomes is becoming very popular, and microbiomes are these are organisms that are within humans, but technically not humans. of our life. So, yeah, I'm not I think I
I-
just kind of rambled.
I echo Dr. Claw's sentiments. As she said earlier about corn, I love corn. I love eating corn. Corn is part of, I mean, I'm Mexican, corn is in my hair. Corn is everywhere, right? Corn is in my life. And so when I learned these scientific things about corn, I'm just as excited as Dr. Claw was. And as an Indigenous person like Dr. Claw, when I was taught science in grade school and high school, it sounded very Indigenous to me, like all of the principles about what science can do for humanity. I'm like, great, I want to do that. And then I feel angry and betrayed because as an adult, that's not how science works. Science is very much tied to politics and money. And so as an Indigenous scientist, of course I want to share data. Of course I want to help people. Of course I want to help the planet. Of course I want to make the data useful for something. But that's not how it works. And so when it comes to, and a lot of Native societies don't want to own this stuff. But if it's a choice between us owning it and then somebody else who's going to use it to harm us or harm other people with it, then I think we should own it. Because obviously it hasn't gone very well for the last 530 years. On specifics on what to do with it, there are some things out there like the Nagoya Protocol, but the United States won't ratify it. Many countries, including Australia, has ratified the Nagoya Protocol, but Canada and the United States won't do that. At least Canada has signed the document. They haven't ratified it. United States hasn't done either. And so again, I was on a call a couple of days ago on traditional knowledge and climate change. And it was, and lots of people were, Native people were there saying what needs to happen. And again, there was resistance and pushback. And one of the things that was brought up was UNDRIP and the Nagoya Protocol, and it was just off the table. It's like, you're asking for a solution. The solution's already out there. You don't want that solution. So then in my mind, what is the holdback? Why don't they want that solution? And it comes down to money again. They just don't want to do things the right way. At least that's my opinion.
Do we have any virtual questions to field? Okay.
Hi, thank you very much. I thought it was fascinating to hear about the work that you do that is sort of adjacent to and after your scientific work when you're thinking about, you talked a little bit about trying to get changes actually implemented and how that's not your personal specialty. You're a scientist, but sometimes you can kind of advise people on how to get things to really happen. And that sounded to me like the kind of thing that like a university tenure board would love to ignore. Is that what happens? Do you feel like you get any recognition for that incredibly important part of your work? And if you don't, is there a way that we could get that situation to be any better?
Yeah, well, I'm in my third year, so I'm up for my mid-tenure review soon. So I guess I'll find out. But I think that by far, what I know of at least many R01 universities' tenure policies, it's really grants you bring in and authorship on publications. So I think that is unfortunately going to be the case at many institutions. But I think that thinking strategically, I think there isn't enough knowledge for trainees going into these tenure track positions. I really didn't have any Indigenous mentors who could really help me on that process. So for me, a lot of the times I'm finding out as I go along. So the same with service obligations, teaching obligations, all of these can be negotiated, and I had to learn this on the fly. So I also found out that some of the things that I'm really passionate about, doing outreach and participating in the Sing workshop every year, those can be a part of my service and a part of my teaching. So the good thing is that I was able to get that into the contract that I signed. So, but unfortunately, a lot of these things that people know, this knowledge isn't really transferred to people who are first-generation college students. My family, I'm the first person in my family to get a PhD and the very first person to work in an academic institution as an investigator. So all of this I'm learning as I go along, and I feel like as we get more people, more trained people in these positions, then we can provide that knowledge for the younger generations, and I'm hoping that sort of is a snowball effect where we get very knowledgeable and savvy people when they're at this stage. So that's my hope for the future, but yeah.
I'm never going to be a tenured academic. I'm going to stay where I am at the Native Biodata Consortium. I just know that other Native academics that me and Katrina know have complained about that very thing, is that not only do they not get credit for working in their own community and doing all this extra work, but then when they're asked to be the Native expert for other things that are outside their discipline, so if they're a genomicist and they're asked to look at something environmental, which isn't something they do, which they get asked all the time by everybody, they don't get credit for that either. So it's definitely a problem being a solitary Native scientist in a university. Lots of people ask for your time, and you don't get compensated either monetarily or in your career, your tenure.
Cool. Well, that brings us to the end of this panel. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. And I just wanted to highlight that the next talk will be in West Poly Ballroom. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.